Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to English as a Second Language. I'm David, and it's so great to have you here with me today. You know, there's nothing I love more than sitting down with you and diving into topics that not only help you improve your English, but also get you thinking about important issues in our world. Today, we're continuing our IELTS series, and I have a topic that I know many of you have strong feelings about. We're going to explore the question, should governments do more to protect the environment? This is actually a really common topic that comes up in IELTS speaking and writing tasks. So we're going to look at different perspectives, useful arguments, and ways to express your opinions clearly and persuasively. And here's something exciting. My good friend Tom is going to join us at the end of today's episode to review some really useful vocabulary that will help you discuss environmental topics with confidence. Tom has this amazing way of making vocabulary stick in your mind, so you definitely don't want to miss that part. But first, let me start with something that happened to me just last week that really got me thinking about today's topic. I was walking through my neighborhood, and I noticed that the city had installed new recycling bins on every corner. There were separate bins for paper, plastic, glass, and general waste. At first, I thought it was great. The government was clearly trying to help people recycle more easily. But then I started watching how people used these bins, and I realized something interesting. Some people were using them correctly, carefully sorting their waste, but many others were just throwing everything into whichever bin was closest. I saw someone throw a plastic bottle into the paper bin, and another person dump food waste into the recycling section. It made me wonder, is it enough for governments to provide the tools for environmental protection? Or do they need to do more to actually change people's behavior? This observation really captures the heart of today's question, doesn't it? Because when we talk about whether governments should do more to protect the environment, we're really asking about the balance between individual responsibility and government action. And that's a complex question with valid arguments on different sides. Let's start by looking at the arguments for why governments should take a more active role in environmental protection. One of the strongest arguments is that environmental problems are simply too big for individuals or private companies to solve alone. Think about climate change, for example. This is a global problem that affects everyone, but it requires coordinated action across countries, industries, and communities. Individual efforts, while important, just aren't enough to address the scale of the challenge. When we talk about issues that are this big, we often use the phrase collective action. This means that everyone needs to work together to solve a problem. And governments are uniquely positioned to coordinate this kind of collective action. They can create laws that apply to everyone. They can invest in large-scale solutions like renewable energy infrastructure, and they can negotiate with other countries to address global environmental challenges. Let me give you a concrete example. In many countries, governments have implemented what we call carbon pricing systems. This is a policy where companies have to pay money when they release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The idea is that by making pollution expensive, companies will have a financial incentive to reduce their emissions. This kind of system can only work if the government creates and enforces it. So individual consumers can't create a carbon pricing system on their own. Another strong argument for government action is that governments have resources that individuals don't have. They can fund research into new technologies. They can invest in infrastructure projects like solar power plants or electric vehicle charging stations, and they can provide subsidies to make environmentally friendly options more affordable for regular people. I think about countries like Denmark, which has invested heavily in wind energy over the past few decades. Today, Denmark gets almost half of its electricity from wind power, and it's become a global leader in wind technology. This didn't happen because individual Danish citizens decided to buy wind turbines for their backyards. It happened because the government made strategic investments and created supportive policies over many years. Governments also have what we call regulatory power. This means they can create rules that everyone has to follow. For example, they can set limits on pollution, require companies to use cleaner technologies, or ban harmful substances. These kinds of regulations can be very effective because they change the rules of the game for everyone at once. Think about the Montreal Protocol, which was an international agreement to phase out chemicals that were damaging the ozone layer. This agreement, which was negotiated by governments around the world, has been incredibly successful. Scientists now say that the ozone layer is healing, and this recovery wouldn't have been possible without coordinated government action. But let's also consider the arguments on the other side. Some people believe that governments shouldn't take on a bigger role in environmental protection, and they have some compelling reasons for this view. One argument is that government intervention can be inefficient and wasteful. Critics point to government programs that spend lots of money but don't achieve their environmental goals. They argue that market forces and private innovation are more effective at finding solutions. When companies compete to create better, cleaner products, they often come up with innovations that governments wouldn't have thought of. Take electric vehicles, for example. While some governments have provided subsidies and incentives, much of the innovation in this field has come from private companies like Tesla. These companies were motivated by the potential for profit, and their innovations have made electric vehicles more practical and appealing to consumers. Another argument is about personal freedom and responsibility. Some people believe that environmental protection should be based on individual choice rather than government mandates. They argue that when governments force people to behave in certain ways, it reduces personal liberty and can create resentment. They prefer approaches that educate people about environmental issues and trust them to make responsible choices. There is also the economic argument. Environmental regulations can be expensive for businesses, and critics worry that strict environmental policies might hurt economic growth or make it harder for companies to compete internationally. They argue that if environmental regulations are too strict in one country, companies might just move their operations to countries with looser rules, which doesn't really solve the environmental problem. This brings us to what I think is the most balanced perspective on this question. Rather than asking whether governments should or shouldn't do more, maybe we should be asking, what is the most effective way for governments to contribute to environmental protection? I think the answer is that we need a combination of approaches. Governments have an important role to play, but that role should be strategic and well-designed. Let me explain what I mean. First, governments are essential for addressing problems that require coordination and long-term thinking. Climate change, air pollution, and water contamination are problems that cross borders and affect future generations. Individual actions, while important, can't solve these problems without some level of government coordination. Second, governments can be most effective when they create the right incentives rather than just creating rules. Instead of just telling people what they can't do, effective environmental policy often focuses on making the right choices easier and more attractive. This might mean providing tax incentives for renewable energy, investing in public transportation, or supporting research into clean technologies. Third, the best environmental policies often combine government action with market mechanisms. For example, cap-and-trade systems allow the government to set overall limits on pollution while letting companies find the most cost-efficient ways to reduce their emissions. This combines the coordinating power of government with the efficiency of market competition. Let me share an example that I think illustrates this balanced approach really well. In the city where I live, the government wanted to reduce plastic waste. Instead of just banning plastic bags, which might have created inconvenience and resistance, they took a more strategic approach. First, they implemented a small fee for plastic bags at stores. This gave people an economic incentive to bring their own reusable bags. Second, they partnered with local businesses to provide high-quality reusable bags at a discount. Third, they launched an education campaign about the environmental impact of plastic waste. And fourth, they invested in better recycling infrastructure to make it easier for people to dispose of plastic properly. This approach combined government policy, economic incentives, business partnerships, public education, and infrastructure investment. And it worked really well. Within 2 years, plastic bag use in the city dropped by more than 60%. This example shows that the question isn't really whether governments should do more or less, but rather how they can act most effectively. The best approaches often involve government leadership combined with private sector innovation and individual responsibility. Let me also talk about the international dimension of this issue. Environmental problems don't respect national borders. So, effective environmental protection often requires governments to work together internationally. This is one area where government action is absolutely essential, because no other institution has the authority to negotiate binding international agreements. The Paris Climate Agreement is an example of this kind of international cooperation. While the agreement isn't perfect, and different countries have different levels of commitment, it represents the kind of coordinated global action that only governments can provide. Private companies or individual citizens couldn't have created this kind of international framework on their own. But international cooperation also highlights some of the challenges of government action. Different countries have different priorities, different economic circumstances, and different political systems. What works in one country might not work in another. This is why international environmental agreements often need to be flexible and allow countries to choose their own approaches to meeting common goals. As we think about this question, I think it's also important to consider what ordinary people can do to support effective government action on environmental issues. In democratic countries, citizens have the power to vote for leaders who prioritize environmental protection. They can also contact their representatives to express their views on environmental policies. Beyond voting, people can participate in public consultations about environmental policies, join environmental organizations that lobby governments, and model environmentally responsible behavior in their own lives. When governments see that citizens are serious about environmental issues, they're more likely to take action. I also think it's important to recognize that this is not an either-or question. We don't have to choose between government action and individual action. The most effective approach to environmental protection involves both. Governments provide the framework, the coordination, and the large-scale investments, while individuals make daily choices that collectively make a big difference. Think about energy conservation in homes. Governments can set building standards that require new homes to be energy efficient, and they can provide rebates for people who install solar panels or improve their insulation. But individuals still need to make choices about how they use energy in their daily lives. Both levels of action are necessary. The same is true for transportation. Governments can invest in public transportation systems and create incentives for electric vehicles, but individuals still need to choose whether to drive, take public transportation, walk, or bike for their daily trips. Now, if you're preparing for the IELTS exam, you might be wondering how to structure your response to this question in a speaking or writing task. Let me give you some practical advice. In IELTS, it's important to present a balanced view that acknowledges different perspectives, even if you have a strong opinion. You might start by acknowledging that this is a complex issue with valid arguments on different sides. Then you can present the main arguments for increased government action, followed by the main arguments for limiting government involvement. Finally, you can present your own view, which might be a balanced position that combines elements of both perspectives. Remember that in IELTS, you're being evaluated on your ability to communicate clearly and persuasively in English, not on whether your opinion is correct. There's no right or wrong answer to this question. What matters is that you can explain your position clearly, support it with relevant examples, and demonstrate your English language skills. Before I hand things over to Tom for our vocabulary review, let me ask you a few questions to help you think about your own position on this topic. First, thinking about your own country, what environmental challenges do you think are most urgent? And do you think these are problems that individuals can solve on their own, or do they require government action? Second, can you think of any examples where your government has taken action to protect the environment? Were these policies effective? Why or why not? Third, what do you think is the biggest obstacle to environmental protection in your country? Is it lack of government action, lack of individual awareness, economic concerns, or something else? And finally, if you were advising your government on environmental policy, what would be your top 3 recommendations? These are exactly the kinds of questions you might encounter in an IELTS speaking test, so thinking about them now will help you prepare. All right, now I'm going to hand things over to my friend Tom, who's going to review some really useful vocabulary for discussing environmental topics. Tom, take it away.
Hey everyone, it's Tom here, and I'm excited to help you master some key vocabulary that will make your environmental discussions much more impactful. Let's dive right in with some words that can really elevate your English. You know, when we talk about environmental issues, one word that comes up constantly is sustainability. This means the ability to maintain something over a long period without harming the environment or using up all the resources. For instance, many companies are now focusing on sustainable business practices to reduce their environmental impact. One more time, many companies are now focusing on sustainable business practices to reduce their environmental impact. Great! Now this connects beautifully to our next term, carbon footprint. This refers to the total amount of greenhouse gases that a person, organization, or activity produces. Here's a practical example. By taking public transportation instead of driving, Sarah significantly reduced her carbon footprint. Let's repeat this one. By taking public transportation instead of driving, Sarah significantly reduced her carbon footprint. Again, by taking public transportation instead of driving, Sarah significantly reduced her carbon footprint. Perfect! Speaking of making positive changes, we often hear about renewable energy. These are energy sources that can be used repeatedly without running out, like solar, wind, or water power. Consider this example. The government invested millions in renewable energy projects to decrease dependence on fossil fuels. Your turn. The government invested millions in renewable energy projects to decrease dependence on fossil fuels. Once more, the government invested millions in renewable energy projects to decrease dependence on fossil fuels. Excellent. This leads us to discuss conservation, which means the protection and preservation of natural resources and the environment. Here's how you might use it. Wildlife conservation efforts have helped bring several endangered species back from near extinction. Let's say it together. Wildlife conservation efforts have helped bring several endangered species back from near extinction. And again, wildlife conservation efforts have helped bring several endangered species back from near extinction. Wonderful. Finally, let's talk about environmental degradation. This is the deterioration of the environment through the depletion of natural resources and the destruction of ecosystems. For example, rapid industrial growth without proper regulations has led to serious environmental degradation in the region. Practice with me. Rapid industrial growth without proper regulations has led to serious environmental degradation in the region. One last time. Rapid industrial growth without proper regulations has led to serious environmental degradation in the region. Fantastic job, everyone.
Well, that brings us to the end of another episode of English as a Second Language. I really hope today's discussion has given you some new ways to think about environmental issues and, more importantly, the language tools you need to express your own thoughts clearly and persuasively. Remember, whether you're preparing for IELTS or just wanting to participate more confidently in conversations about important topics, the key is practice. Try using some of the vocabulary and arguments we discussed today in your own conversations. Think about your own position on environmental issues and practice explaining your views in English. Environmental protection is one of the most important challenges of our time, and being able to discuss it thoughtfully in English will serve you well in both academic and professional settings. The ability to present balanced arguments, consider different perspectives, and support your position with relevant examples, these are skills that will benefit you in many areas of life. Thank you so much for joining Tom and me today. Keep practicing, keep learning, and remember that every conversation is an opportunity to improve your English. I'll see you next week for another episode in our IELTS series, where we'll tackle another thought-provoking topic that will help you express your ideas with confidence. Until then, take care and keep making your English even stronger.